Madam Professor Adeningsi, Agus, dear organizers of the conference, ladies and gentlemen, Selamat pagi, Rahmat. I'm very pleased and honored to speak this morning to this audience and to this conference. And if right now, maybe that's better. If just some moments ago we have got a very broad and very comprehensive macro picture of the ASEAN economic community, my presentation will just take a different perspective. How does it work? I will take a quite different perspective and will take a micro look at what might and go on in ASEAN, in the ASEAN economic community after it has been established on the 31st of December 2015. In fact, the ASEAN sorry, it doesn't work. Maybe you can move the slide, so obviously it doesn't respond. Okay, in 2015, the ASEAN Economic Community was launched, and as you probably know, and as have you heard, the ASEAN Economic Community pursues four major objectives: establishing a single market and production base, to develop Southeast Asia as a competitive economic region, to create equitable economic development, and to fully integrate the region in the global economy. Now, this all has launched quite a number of expectations for accelerated economic growth, especially in the region's more advanced economy, especially Singapore and Thailand, the two countries that have made the proposal to create an ASEAN economic community way back in the early 2000s. But it has also created apprehensions and fears among some of the weaker economies that they might be flooded with cheap foreign products, and that local businesses may come under pressure and have to struggle for their survival. And the precedent for that was the ASEAN-China free trade area, which especially here in Indonesia caused a lot of controversy, and a lot of small and medium-scale industries were very much afraid that the market opening would be at their detriment. Now, also the ASEAN economic community, unlike the European single market, only liberalized the flow of skilled labor. Apprehension also surfaced that market opening would also accelerate labor mobility, as already prior to the ASEAN economic community, the number of intra-regional labor migration has risen to more than 6 million people. You have seen the figures before. And now, also given the other point that was raised in the presentation by Professor Adeningsi, that ASEAN and Southeast Asia is a quite diverse region with enormous wealth disparities between the countries. It is also thinkable that there are strong push and pull factors which might accelerate labor migration. And if that would materialize, they would presumably strengthen propensity of governments in the region, at least some, to categorize labor migration as a non-traditional security problem. Now, in my presentation, perhaps you could move the slide ahead. I will try to explain what is going on in terms of debates about labor migration related to the ASEAN Economic Community. And I would develop a short analytical framework which is borrowed from the so-called securitization concept of the Copenhagen School of International Relations, and following that I will provide you some methodological thoughts about the study that I conducted several months ago, share with you some of the empirical findings, and then go to some conclusion. Now, as far as labor migration is concerned, there are two theory-guided arguments which are closely aligned and closely linked to the liberalization of economies. One is that labor triggers fears in the local population that give securitizing actors a pretext for securitizing labor migration. These factors are material factors. I've put that here in the slide, related to factors such as job competition, education, income. The main argument here is that through accelerated immigration, the pie gets smaller for the local population. Better trained immigrants take jobs from the locals who are relegated to less well remunerated position. There's unemployment rising, and this problem is even exacerbated if the local labor force is growing rapidly, and this growth cannot be absorbed by economic growth, especially in periods of economic recession. And then the argument goes that this would spur sentiments of relative deprivation in the local population, or at least substantial segments of it. And as a result, income and wealth distribution will be associated with nationality, or even with primordial factors such as religion and ethnicities. And the fear is that such sentiments may eventually become a source of escalating social unrest. Then there's a second set of arguments that I would call cognitive or ideational factors. They are related to the loss of national or cultural identities through immigration. People living in labor destination countries may view their country as being flooded by foreigners, which as a result of the then concomitant demographic transformation relegates locals to aliens in their home country, and in labor destination countries such sentiments are often going hand in hand with negative attitudes towards economic liberalization, or what has been called neoliberal globalization, and tends to intensify with adverse economic scope conditions like specific demographic characters such as the aging of societies, and in particular, of course, volatile, ethnically, religiously, and culturally divided societies. So that are some of the fears that are derived from the problem surrounding labor migration. Southeast Asia, as we have heard right now, is a success story. It's an economic success story, even though in the past there have also been major crises, the Asian financial crisis, for instance, and as I mentioned earlier, there are serious inequities between the countries, inside the countries, and that has given rise, surprisingly perhaps, but nevertheless, to a quite skeptical worldview among many policymakers here in Indonesia, but also in Singapore. Even in Singapore and in some other countries, you often find some sort of a vulnerability discourse that highlights that the countries of Southeast Asia are surrounded by a quite hostile international environment, and that these countries always have to struggle for their survival. And this gives a strong political position to so-called securitizers, which are, for instance, the security forces, the army, the police, intelligence, the Ministry of Interior, immigration offices, who sometimes also have a tendency to mission creep, to enlarge their missions to wider civilian purviews. Now, the securitization approach of the Copenhagen school that I mentioned is interesting in the sense that it allows to link the problem of labor migration to this school of thought. It's not new. There are many studies in Europe that have applied that, but it's relatively infrequently used in Southeast Asia. Here the term sometimes appears, but very rarely it has been developed to a theoretical concept. And I share the position of my Southeast Asian colleagues who think that this is a good framework for the application in Southeast Asia as well. Now, one of the problems of these studies is to regard any kind of a speech act defining labor migration as a security problem and as evidence of securitization. Now, of course, such utterings can be considered as securitization moves, but however, these analysts tend to ignore the fact that such speech acts are not framed as an existential threat, that is a threat jeopardizing the survival of the state as the referent object. And also, governments often use security discourses to justify restrictions on labor mobility. In many cases, these policy shifts defy what the Copenhagen school defines as extraordinary measures. And the extraordinary measures would be, for instance, mass deportations or physically punishing irregular migrants, as once in a while governments, not only here in the region, tend to do. Now, in other words, studies using the securitization theory to analyze labor migration exhibit a methodological shortcoming, and that's what I try to overcome through developing a taxonomy which shows what I believe is securitization and allows the application of the theory to the nexus of the ASEAN Economic Community and labor mobility. I consider the ASEAN Economic Community as a critical juncture, as a new step in the region economically, politically, that also changes the thinking about labor migration, and this would, that's my assumption, giving rise to an exacerbation, to a strengthening of labor migration perceived as a security threat by governments in the region. Now, just in a nutshell, the securitization theory is a theory, the international relations people here know that, combines realism and constructivism. It's considering security threats as socially and politically constructed, and this construction happens through a discursive process in which language plays the major role, and the securitization happens through securitization actors who portray a certain social phenomenon, labor migration in this case, as an existential threat to a referent object, which is the state, and which should be fought and should be combated by emergency measures, very extraordinary procedures in order to cope with the problem. And one of the major preconditions also is that these measures have legitimacy. They have legitimacy if the audience, if the people agree with them, accept them. In my case, of course, the referent objects are the Southeast Asian states, its national sovereignty. The securitization actors are security agencies, and the audience, of course, is the general public. Now, in my study, just briefly to the methodology, I compared the press discourse in 4 Southeast Asian countries because I believe that it is basically the press that is used as a catalyst for these debates. Yes, I know. Therefore, it gives a very good picture of what the governments and the public agents think about labor migration. I chose 4 countries, the Philippines and Indonesia and Singapore and Malaysia, based on a selection, a systematic case selection following John Gehring, considering these cases as crucial cases. I cannot go, for time reasons, deeper into the methodology. Perhaps just briefly inform you that I did a newspaper analysis to accessible archives, to LexisNexis, which is a data set, and any access that I could get to respective journal articles. I coded these articles. I did some inductive coding in order not to overlook something which a narrow theoretical perspective would entail. And I tried to order the empirical findings by country, language of the newspaper, English or vernacular languages, worldviews championed by the newspapers and the actors who voice their opinions on labor migration, like government, business, civil society representatives. Now, you could show briefly the slides. Altogether, I analyzed 72 newspapers, and you see the majority are English, but I also tried to get access to local vernacular journals. What I also did was to develop a taxonomy of what securitization or what politicization is, because as I said earlier, not everything what terms or what is related to security issues is a process of securitization. Therefore, I distinguished between extreme politicization, which is securitization, and I defined it, politicization, and an absence or low level of politicization. Now, what are the empirical findings? Reporting on labor migration is abundant in the region, but interestingly, only a moderate number of hits made the link between the ASEAN Economic Community and labor migration, which immediately suggests that no securitization has taken place so far. The majority of these articles, also somewhat surprising for me, appeared in the Indonesian print media, while in the Philippines, Singapore, and in particular in Malaysia, only a few articles could be identified. And this is a surprising finding, given that Indonesia is a labor exporting country, while Malaysia and Singapore are destination countries where labor migrants are often stereotyped, and sentiments of discontent with a high percentage of foreign workers are frequently articulated in private, but also in the public discourse. Now, in fact, while acknowledging that at least articles in the Indonesian print media were not free from fears of the anticipated labor-related consequences of the ASEAN Economic Community for the country's sovereignty, it is also safe to conclude that the limited number of newspaper articles found firmly rules out securitization also in the Indonesian case. Even though there are periods when Indonesian newspapers, especially prior to the inauguration of the ASEAN Economic Community, run more articles about the nexus of labor migration and the ASEAN Economic Community. But nevertheless, it's definitely not at an intensity that you can speak of a securitization. On the other hand, the Indonesian case is also interesting because you could observe at least a certain level of politicization of the issues, which gives security issues a relatively high priority in the reporting of the press. It's often critically reported with regard to labor migration, especially in the Indonesian language press. As we saw, looked at Republika as a Indonesian language paper, precisely because I anticipated that in a pro-Islamic newspaper there would be more skepticism towards neoliberal economic openings, and that was indeed confirmed, and there were quite a number of articles that reported what in individual provinces in East Java, in West Java, in Batam is happening in terms of labor migration after the launching of the ASEAN Economic Community. And that suggested some level of concern, and also brought in the security agencies, immigration in particular, and even at one point where the immigration offices cooperates very closely with the Babinsa, the lowest level of the military at the village level, in order to control the influx of foreign labor. And also interesting was that the influx of foreign labor was not influx that could be related to other ASEAN countries, but to more economically developed countries, China, Taiwan, South Korea. These were the ones who constituted the bulk of that additional labor migration after the ASEAN Economic Community. And there was concern in the press that these phenomena might increase as the ASEAN Economic Community develops further. Then there was also a certain security issue brought up in connection with labor migration, the trafficking of humans. Indonesia, seen as a transient country on the way to Australia and New Zealand, transnationally organized crime was a theme that is related to labor migration, and also often or occasional references to other countries in the region that seem to consider labor migration after the ASEAN Economic Community as a national security threat, in which often Thailand was mentioned, and also in Singapore there was some tendency to criminalize labor migrants, but interestingly not in the newspapers that I checked, but rather in a previous study, a survey conducted a number of years before. But the interesting thing is that in Indonesia you could also observe de-securitization in labor migration reports. Here the influx of know-how is emphasized, making the region more competitive and to avoid brain drain to North America, Europe, China or India as reference points. Now, one commonality of the articles is that for all 4 countries, the press overwhelmingly, or at least in the majority, evaluated labor migration quite critically. One half of the articles reports about problems associated with labor migration and believes that under the ASEAN Economic Community these problems even intensify and aggravate. And so in the long run there is indeed a potential for a securitization which justifies a study like this, but at the moment it's merely politicization at a certain level. Interesting in the findings is also that the majority of these critical articles that I encountered were geared towards skilled labor, not unskilled labor. You would expect unskilled labor due to these exploitational cases and the many excessive and unkind treatment of unskilled laborers. No, it was about skilled laborers, and at the center of the critique were the so-called mutual recognition agreements, which have been concluded in ASEAN for 8 major professions: nursing, architecture, medicine, dentistry, tourism, surveying, and accountancy. And it's also interesting that this only covers 1 point of the labor force in general. Low-skilled labor is also, of course, mentioned. The second point that is critically mentioned, and here it's particularly the exploitation that frequently is brought up. In a country-wise comparison, it can be shown that Indonesian and Singaporean news reports are more critical towards the ASEAN Economic Community-induced labor migrations as the others. Also, the vernacular language newspapers are more critical than the English language newspapers, which can be easily explained because many of these English language newspapers are close to business conglomerates that have an interest in market opening. And stockholder-wise, the situation is a bit ambiguous. It seems that international organizations have a relatively favorable view about labor migration and the ASEAN Economic Community, but admit that there might be problems in store. Governments have different perspectives. The security agencies are quite skeptical about it. The economic ministries usually support it. And also the business is divided. There are a number of pro-Asian Economic Community business who think to benefit from especially skilled labor migration. But there are also strong objections and apprehensions that this might lead to brain drain. Now, coming to the conclusion, what the study has shown, I have just summarized the question from the description of how do the countries respond to ASEAN Economic Community related labor migration, to the why, to provide some explanation. Why is there no securitization? First of all, in Indonesia, the country that brings up most security concerns, which is the most surprising fact, because Indonesia is a labor exporting country. One thing is that in terms of numbers, the foreign labor immigrants are still limited. Second, there are other issues that are more conducive to securitization than labor migration, like international terrorism, maritime boundary conflicts, drug and narcotics trafficking. And why is there more politicization in Indonesia and Singapore? In both countries, that's my assessment, is the vulnerability and survival discourse deeply inculcated in the cultural memory of security elites, a great sensitivity to external developments and their impact on the country. And in Indonesia, there's also, at least that's my reading, an attempt of the security forces to recover lost political ground after the end of the new order, and border issues are conducive to that undertaking. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm looking forward to your questions.